Dr. Lennox Honychurch, the Anthony and Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence Laureate for Public and Civic Contributions 2011. Welcome to Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good.
You've been selected as the 2011 Laureate in Public and Civic Contributions, but your work has been in fields normally associated with arts and letters. You're a historian, you're an archaeologist, you are a museologist. So could you tell us a little bit about your work and, in its totality before we get into the individual bits of it?
Yeah. Well, essentially, I've been using things which are associated with arts and letters for public consumption and for public development in terms of a country understanding about itself. And you cannot use the more traditional formal methods of education if you're going to try to engage with a wider public. And so I have been using all of these areas in terms of even art, carnival costumes, museums, public places of events, and of course historic sites to be able to build up a bank of knowledge which the public can consume. So it's multifaceted. You're using very different types of media, but the objective is the same, that you have public awareness and public involvement in their heritage.
The First Peoples, the Kalinago, they have a large population in Dominica, and they have a piece of land or an area, territory, set aside for them. And this came at independence in Dominica, or was it later?
Yeah, at independence they had a formal piece of legislation, but actually the Carib territory is at least just over 100 years old. When Dominica was colonized, the last island in the Caribbean to be colonized formally, only in the 1760s. So the indigenous people were still living there, which was very rare for any of those other smaller islands. And they retreated as the British came and started doing their plantations and cutting down the forest to grow sugar cane. They shifted to this isolated spot. And when later on, the whole attitude to indigenous people had changed, and there was a administrator, British administrator for Dominica. And he was very enlightened. He had studied the history and stuff. And he felt that for all the Caribbean they had lost, that one little area should be reserved for them that they could continue to live. And so he devised this Carib territory. Carib Reserve, he called it. Today it's called the Kalinago Territory. And some 2,500, 3,000 inhabitants live there. They are descendants of those original people.
But you yourself, you told me that your family has been in the region for almost 300 years.
Well, yes. My God knows how many great-grandparents came to Barbados from the south of England, from Devon, where there is actually still a village called Honychurch. And they came first and settled in Barbados, but then, like Caribbean families moved around, I have a grandmother that was born in San Fernando, Trinidad, and other territories in the Caribbean. And then they moved, a group of them moved to Dominica. So you have all of these links.
And these links are very important to your work because you've done an enormous amount of work in Dominica, but your work has also been very visible and present throughout the region. Yes? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I would say so, because I was also educated in Barbados, so that from the age of 10 gave me a perspective of the broader Caribbean. Therefore, in my work, I tied in what I was doing in Dominica, and it extended to the other islands. For instance, the work that I have done in restoring buildings was inspired by what was happening elsewhere in the Caribbean in the 1970s. You had the restoration of the big Brimstone Hill Fortress in St. Kitts, which is now a World Heritage Site. Pigeon Island in St. Lucia. The work in Barbados by the National Trust, The work here in Trinidad, where in the 70s, people like John Newell Lewis and others were writing books about the traditional architecture of Trinidad. So all of this put together inspired me to extend my work. And then when I was invited to do a series of history books for texts for schools, all of this came together in the fact that many of the other historians who were writing were high university professors, or they were British people who really knew the subject, but they didn't have the feel for the region. And so I was able to put all of these together in a Caribbean-wide book.
So this was the Caribbean people?
And that was the Caribbean people, yes.
Okay, which is a textbook.
It's a textbook which is used throughout the Caribbean. It was first published in 1979 and 1980-81 because there are 3 volumes. And it has been re-edited and reissued many times since. So it's been going for well over 20 years.
It's highly unusual to find a single person that does all these things. Why would you, why? How did this happen?
Well, actually, I started off, when I first left school, I started off in radio. Dominica was setting up its first radio station run by the government, and they issued applications. I applied, and I became a reporter and announcer. And besides news, I was interested in doing radio programs. And I realized that myself and many of the people within this kind of fledgling nation of Dominica didn't know very much about our past. And I felt that I could use the radio to make programs that made people more aware. And so I started off with a kind of history series, but it was done in a kind of soap opera fashion in a way. It always ended on an exciting point so that you would tune in the next day for another edition. And they were very short, like 8-10-minute segments. So it was easy to absorb. And that went down very well. People, in rum shops and all that were stopping work and listening and so. And then they said, why don't you do a book? So I did a book. And then the Caribbean people came up because people had seen the work I had done on the Dominica thing. And then what was happening as well is that the interest in the historic buildings came in to link with the work I was doing. At that time in the Caribbean, the archaeological movement was developing, and we were finding things which we didn't understand, and we were bringing archaeologists from Martinique and various places to come and study. So that was coming on board. And I think also it was that time in the Caribbean, the end of the 60s going through the 1970s was a very dynamic time in the Caribbean. The sort of early days of nationalism, people felt, that we will achieve together all these wonderful things. And there were lots of activists in drama, in art, in knowledge, the development of the University of the West Indies, a big expansion during the 1970s. And all of this was coming together, and I was there. And that was the great thing. I think that if it had been today and I was 19, it wouldn't have been the same. But to be there at that time, at that cusp of events in the Caribbean. Yeah.
But you did a lot of this without any formal tertiary education.
No, well, that's right.
And then you proceeded to Oxford. Could you tell us how that happened?
Yeah, well, what happened is because I got this opportunity immediately after leaving school to get this job in the radio, which I really wanted. I liked the medium and so. So I decided, look, I'll leave school and I'll go into this job. I'll deal with university later. But then what happened is all these other things unfolded, and the writing of the books and everything. And then I actually went to the University of the West Indies and asked Professor Woodville Marshall in Barbados at Cave Hill, look, I've been doing all of this work, but I haven't got a degree. Could I come and do a BA history at you? So he said, but it's ridiculous because the students you will be with are students who have gone through secondary school and done your book. And I said, but I must have one. He said, yeah, that's okay, you can leave it a while. I went on to other things, and then I felt, it really should be done. And so I applied, I got a scholarship, and luckily, Oxford University in England was willing to accept me based on my work that I had done. And I was able to do my master's, and because I got a distinction and stuff, they were willing to extend the scholarship to a doctorate, and that was in anthropology, which was good. I was going to do history, just specifically, but the great thing about anthropology is it's broad enough to take on board historical texts, interviews with people of a certain group or various groups, and the archaeology and the study of material culture, housing, art, and all of that.
Now, from the time you described that you started in the 70s to now, there seems to have been a shift in attitude. How are the feelings about the government and nationalisms concerning heritage sites, history, and culture in the way you approached it?
Well, I think that what you find, going back to that period of the 70s, there was this big burst. And then in the 80s, as happened elsewhere in the world, people got very materialistic and utilitarian, and governments didn't necessarily want to extend their budgets to that kind of thing. And therefore, it depended very heavily on individuals to be able to push that national agenda for subjects related to culture, the arts, and all that. On the surface, the governments did establish departments of culture and all of that. But that was kind of a kind of bureaucratic civil service thing. But the real big impetus was coming from individuals outside of it. And that is why I felt that I had a role, and the other people that work with me had a role to provide something for the country that was outside of government.
You were, I believe, the youngest legislator in Dominica's history, and you were also a part of the team that negotiated for independence in 1978. Tell us how you got into politics, and how old were you?
Well, I was 22, and to be a member of our assembly, you have to be 21. At the time, in the 70s, I was the youngest in the Caribbean, but I'm sure there are many other younger ones now. Anyway, the thing is that with radio and the popularity that had grown with radio, when in 1975 Eugenia Charles became the leader of the opposition in Dominica, she basically called me in and said, I am offering you this position and I very much want you to take it. I knew I was going to lose a lot because my involvement with the radio station was the opposition party, not the opposite party, the government. And I would not be able to continue in that way. But it was a new departure, so I said yes. And so I became a member of the opposition, and that was a key time again. It was the mid-70s, and we were negotiating for independence. And my role was very much twofold. One was to look at the Constitution and see what kind of Constitution we really could be able to get. The other was to go out in the public with Eugenia Charles and go into all these villages and schools and so, and explain the Constitution, explain why our party was deciding to have these other types of constitutional development. Because the government wanted to, they had a draft constitution, which was just the usual monarchical constitution where Queen Elizabeth II would be head of state, and you would have a governor general, and there would be a senate, and the whole pattern that was classic. This is what was given to us. And we said, no, I mean, there are certain requirements and needs that we have. Electoral commission we need. You can't have one person run an election. There were other aspects, the whole Republican issue of having a president, what kind of president. So finally we got our way. I mean, Dominica was the first island in the Caribbean, former British island, to go directly into the Republican status. And then eventually Eugenia Charles won the government in 1980 and became the first woman in the Caribbean to be a prime minister. And she appointed me press secretary. But then, bit by bit, I was concerned about this aspect of being pigeonholed, and I felt that somebody else could do this politics. But there were aspects that I felt needed to be handled, and therefore I pulled out, I resigned, and then I moved more totally into the aspects of using art and heritage and all that for public works.
Okay, now from your unique perspective, having been involved in this work, in culture, art, history, for the last 40 years, tell me what you think the Caribbean's future is. Where is the Caribbean going in a general
Well,
sense?
well, there again, I mean, we had this great burst in the 60s for places like Trinidad and Barbados and Guyana. There's nationalism of the 60s going into the 70s, a very dynamic time. But then the difficulty of being small island states in a very difficult world economy of globalization, all of that came in the 90s, you know, and particularly if you were producing agricultural crops, any protectionism was gone. The World Trade Organization, the European Union, all of these things came upon us. And so it has become increasingly difficult for prime ministers to have this very nationalist, emotional concept of government. It becomes much more down to brass tacks and practical and desperately trying to find a way of maintaining a quality of life that people will accept. And so it's become far more difficult. The whole world situation has changed. And we know that many of the smaller states are turning to what were considered non-traditional assistance, like China, the aspect areas of the Middle East, and also in our case, and some of the others of Venezuela. You know, we're criticized for this. But the problem is that when you are a small island state, without resources, for instance, like Trinidad has and others, you really have to scout around as much as possible and see where you're going to get that assistance. And therefore, this aspect of kind of early nationalism doesn't have a role to play in that. Yes, you want to make the people feel they are part of their country. That is important. But you've also got to go and make deals with every kind of foreign government and national, international corporation to be able to invest, to make things happen. And so you've got to become very much more a citizen, an acceptor of the world at large, which may not be too much of a bad thing. But at the same time, you've got an environmental component, because we are small, very delicate islands. And you've got to provide these needs while at the same time seeing that they're not totally overrun. And also, as you open yourself up, you have got to accept that many other people from all over the world are going to come and buy up parts of your land. Now, that nationalism of the 70s was sort of Arrow, the Calypsonian from Montserrat, you know, had a song entirely about keep your land for your generation and your children. Now this is going away, and all over the islands, all up the Grenadines, land is being sold to huge conglomerates internationally. It's a very difficult balance to maintain. And I see it in a way that the Caribbean, for those territories that do not have that kind of natural resources, have got to play a very careful game, or else the leadership of the countries will just be token, and the real power behind the throne will be foreign conglomerates and multimillionaires that want a place in the sun.
Dr. Lennox Honychurch, the Anthony and Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence Laureate for Public and Civic Contributions 2011. Thank you for coming, Dr. Honychurch.
Pleasure.
Okay.